Being able to handle criticism is necessary for being a YouTuber. I fully understand that and have been trying to avoid getting extra mad or leaving a terrible comment in response to the ones I get pretty much on a daily basis. But I'd be a complete liar if I acted like the comments on my Yuta versus Toji video didn't leave me all different kinds of frustrated and irritated. When stepping into a new community, it's basically uncharted territory. When I put out a Naruto video, I can pretty much gauge what the comment section is going to be from the topic alone because I've interacted with the community for the past 4 years of my life. I'm relatively fresh into the JJK community, so a lot of what people said caught me off guard. I saw tons of agreements, obviously, but also tons of disagreements, and the disagreements never really sat well with me. A lot of the times they were incoherent or just blatantly wrong, and it got to a point where I was obviously like, yeah, enough is enough, let me make a follow-up video. I'll admit firsthand that I took it a bit far with some of the arguments and I didn't give Yuta enough credit in certain areas. However, I also need to reaffirm my stance on Toji and how strong I think he is, especially in comparison to people like Maki and Yuta. I'll also say that regardless of who you take in this fight, I do not think it's a stomp for either side. If you think Toji wins, it'll be a hard fight for him, and if you think Yuta wins, it'll be a hard fight for him. Also, just like with my last video, I need to mention JJK is a currently ongoing manga, so it is plausible that I could get proven wrong at any point in the future. Although since Gojo vs Sukuna is going on right now, and it's not showing any signs of slowing down over the next few weeks, that could be a while. Before we begin, I'd like to ask if you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel, as I'd really appreciate it. And now I definitely plan to make more JJK content in the future. Starting with Toji, I need to cover his fight with Gojo, and more specifically the second fight that happens on chapters 74 and 75. In these chapters, Toji meets the end of his life and he gets dominated by Gojo for the most part. I'd obviously never deny the fact that Gojo beat Toji, but like everything else, context is important, and especially so to this fight. This is something we didn't really learn until Maki was introduced, but for the heavenly restricted people, their mental state is very important to their performance in a battle. Before this, I could see this maybe not seeming to matter because they don't have a cursed energy flow to mess up or cursed techniques they need to implement. They just swing around cursed tools, but it's actually very important for them. In chapter 196, we see Maki become fully realized after a series of sumo matches with Miyu in his domain. These matches are introduced to us by telling us that Maki is too tense and it's causing her to lose her edge. Maki also mentions how she's overthinking and just needs to blow off some steam. Funnily enough, she starts comparing herself to Edo Toji, wondering what's the difference between the two of them and what she can't see. Being tense, overthinking, and not being able to focus all prevented Maki from being free. They prevented her from gaining access to everything that she had. It's why she was weaker than Toji. It's why Naoya couldn't see her as Toji at first, and it's why after she gains these things, Naoya finally starts to see her as Toji, or a Toji level threat. So what do we see in the second fight, Toji versus Gojo? Toji is overthinking, feeling uneasy, and even self-admittedly, he had deviated from his true self, which he says at that point he had already lost. I think this, coupled with the statement that Toji used to fight with the strength on par with Gojo from the volume extras, just lets us know that Toji isn't exactly at his best in this second fight. I'd also like to touch on the first fight as well, or I guess more specifically, the statement about Toji wearing Gojo down. I largely disagree with the interpretation that this just makes Toji weaker than Gojo at this point. Taking a look back at the conversation Toji has with Shiyu Kong, the handler for the Star religious group, Toji does say so long as Gojo is with Amenai, no one can take her, but when asked if he was included in that statement, his reply is just simply, good question, implying that he's not so sure himself. This leads me to the conclusion that wearing Gojo down and trying to take him out in one stab with a non-curse tool is a precaution since he doesn't know what will happen if he engages with fighting the sorcerer. We have to keep in mind Toji is out of practice at this point. He even says the goal was to take Gojo out with the initial stab, and since he was unable to do that, he must be rusty, only claiming to be getting the hang of things again after he defeats Gojo in round 1. So what does all this mean? This part really has nothing to do with Yuta. I'm just trying to say that the downplay arguments for Toji don't really function when given a deeper look into the context of the topic. The next one of these I want to go over is Maki supposedly admitting she's weaker than Yuta because of this statement on 211, and that isn't what she says here. I don't know how an entire section of the fandom gaslighted themselves into ignoring a whole other half of a statement, but the statement does not say Yuki was on the same level as Yuta and lost to Kenjaku. I guess that means I can't beat him. She says Yuki was on the same level as Yuta and she had the help of the death painting, Choso obviously, and Tengen and still lost. This is implying, at the very least, that the team of Choso, Tengen, and Yuki would be capable of producing results that Maki doesn't think she can replicate on her own. That's all I had to say about that statement though. It just doesn't say Maki thinks Yuta is stronger than her. This final argument is just one I brung up before in my last video, that Maki was keeping up with 15 Finger and making me Sukuna. A lot of people seem to dislike this argument, and for good reason, but this will slowly move into the Yuta section. So I'll say this much. If we are to believe that Maki is at the very least equal to reanimated Toji from Shibuya, then there is no way Sukuna is only at 10% when it comes to his speed, because Toji is stated to be at least 3 finger level. If Sukuna was at 10% keeping up with Maki, it'd make Maki around 1.5 finger level or weaker if any. So it does give more credence to the lightning fan translation of the 10% only being in terms of the output on his curse technique and not to his overall stats. It also really makes sense with how Sukuna was fighting and the immediate move he made directly following this realization, which was to instead aim his curse technique at the ground and follow it up with a punch on Maki. The issue I now have with this argument is that it basically implies that Maki could just speed blitz Yuta because, 15 finger Sukuna, speed blitz Ryu could keep up with Yuta, blah blah blah. And I don't think that's true. I think it's actually relatively absurd. But what if when Yuta was fighting Ryu and Uro, he was just holding back on them? The implication for this is small, but after the climax of the giant battle, Uro is telling Yuta that he's reaching his limit and that she's seen it. What surpasses the horizons of sorcerers, cursed spirits, and strong fighters is overwhelming aggression that disregards all else like a calamity, and it's showing Sukuna. This is a misinterpretation of Yuta's character for one. They think he's unwilling to kill and spares his opponents, but the only reason he's doing that is because of the rule to take their points. Ryu says this and Yuta only replies maybe, but then he says he should be grateful to his comrade. He's probably saying that because of the rule that they added that allowed Yuta to do that. Now I know this really only implies he was holding back in terms of lethality, which doesn't necessarily mean that he'd have to hold back his speed to do so, but this inherently prevents you from going all out. Being a bit selfish with the win by any means mentality not only removes your limiters, but it can also help you grow as well. Take for example Megami in his fight with the second finger bearer. He visualized himself winning and opened a domain expansion, the peak of Jujutsu sorcery. Even Sukuna says this much to Jogo after Jogo's death. Humans flocking together, curses flocking together, comparing themselves to those around them, leads to weakness and stunts their growth. You should have burnt everything you desired to a cinder to reach the heights of Satoru Gojo and not worry about your future or identity. Sukuna is basically saying your own power is all that matters, and the part about burning everything to a cinder is the overwhelming aggression that Uro mentioned earlier that Sukuna himself has. Even Hanami back in Goodwill is a pretty nice example of this. Mahito tells Hanami that its soul feels restrained or constricted because it doesn't enjoy fighting and that it should in reality be much stronger. And once Hanami starts enjoying his fight with Yuji and Todo, we start to see it get stronger. But that's pretty much the end of that argument. I think Yuta was potentially capped when he was fighting them. Maybe he wouldn't have done exactly what Sukuna did and speed blitz and bisect Ryu's head at full power, but the battle would have probably been easier for him. And let's not forget that the majority of the time, it was a 1v2 or a battle royale, not just Yuta versus Ryu. But yeah, let's just move on from here. Okay, so this part is being added in after I recorded the rest of the video, but if Yuta is the second strongest sorcerer after Gojo, and you count Sukuna as a sorcerer like the story does mention, then it would make Yuta stronger than 15 finger Sukuna inside of Yuji. And I know he gets more curse techniques inside of Megami, but his physical stats maybe would be lower because Megami's body isn't as strong as Yuji's is. So maybe that can indicate as well that Yuta is on like a 15 finger level and was holding back on Uro Ryu. But yeah, I just thought I'd mention that. I want to address this statement about Yuta being second to Gojo in the modern era. This statement comes from chapter 173, which is before Maki's full realization into a Toji level fighter. So my normal response to this would just be that it was simply made before Maki got stronger, so applying the statement doesn't work, since it'd be like saying Usain Bolt was the fastest man alive in 2010 and he'd still be the fastest man alive in 2030. However, the statement was reiterated in the character popularity poll, which I don't have the exact release date for, but it doesn't matter. I know it came out after Maki's awakening. That's all that really matters. If Yuta is the second strongest sorcerer, it would make him stronger than Maki, who is considered a sorcerer and who is equal to Toji. The thing about statements like this is the vagueness of them, and I know some of you are sitting there thinking that it doesn't seem all that vague to me. The statement means he's the second strongest, and yeah, I agree, but that's only direct in one way. Let me ask you a couple of questions. When is Yuta the second strongest? Is it when he's alone without Rika? Is it when he puts his ring on and gets his curse techniques and curse tools and access to Rika and more curse energy? Is it when he activates his domain, since that's the peak of Jujutsu sorcery? All those questions are why I think that this statement is kind of vague, so let's try to get to the bottom of it. Yuta does say Hakari is stronger than him when he gets on a roll, and there is a weekly statement that confirms this at the very least. So yeah, maybe it's not Yuta on his own, we can eliminate that one. But I'm going to be straightforward here, that's really the only one that I can answer and say it's probably not at that point. Whether or not it's in his domain or just with Rika that he's the second strongest is relatively unanswerable, at least with the current knowledge that we have. I think saying it applies to Yuta at his strongest is probably going to be the most consistent interpretation, and I need to be heard out on this one. If the statement were to apply to Yuta with Rika out, then it would by extension also have to apply to domain Yuta, right? However, the same is not true for the reverse. It could apply to domain Yuta, but that wouldn't mean it applies to Yuta with Rika out outside of the domain. Meaning that it being Yuta in his domain is just more likely. I don't think I had to explain domain expansion and how they are the peak of Jujutsu sorcery and how you get a stat amp in them, sure hit attacks, blah 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 blah. The thing about this is that it doesn't mean much for fighting Toji, since without Toji's consent, he can't be trapped inside of a domain expansion due to having zero curse energy, just like Maki. And on top of that, even if he does enter one, the sure hit can't detect him for that same reason, so it would register him as an inanimate object. I don't want to make too many claims on Yuta's domain though, since anyone who's read the story can tell you we don't exactly know what it does yet. So in all honesty, it could have a part similar to Sukuna's where it can register inanimate objects and attack them, but if we are to use actual barrier domains as an example, I find this to be extremely unlikely, and it's more likely that Yuta would just waste cursed energy trying to use this on Toji. This entire section of the video is basically trying to say that just because Yuta is the second strongest doesn't mean he can just beat Maki or just outright beat Toji. There is a nuance to it that can make it not as direct. I don't plan to backtrack on what I said in the intro to the video though. I still do think it would be a hard fight for either of those, but in case anyone wants to just hear me say it, yes, I do agree that at his max, with his domain and whatever, that Yuta is stronger than Toji. He just can't use that in a fight with him. There is another part of this that I covered in my last video that I have gotten more information on since then. that being Toji's soul splitting sword and Yuta's ability, or I guess rather inability, to counter the sword since it ignores your durability and directly cuts your soul. There is actual evidence that Yuta can perceive the soul at the very least. In chapter 90, when Gojo is being sealed, Kenjaku is talking to him about how he doesn't think Yuta is all that, and all his power is a result of him having to detain his loved one's soul, blah blah blah. This at the very least proves Yuta and his cursed energy can interact with the soul, but we do know that this was done by accident. Yuta didn't mean to curse Rika or detain her soul. After the curse unravels and Rika is left standing there, Yuta is able to hug her before she goes off into the afterlife or wherever souls go in JJK. And we know this is Rika's soul because when Kenjaku says is how he's detaining his loved one's soul, this is the panel that's shown. So at the very least, Yuta can interact with the soul. We know that much, but I'll say it's really unclear on whether or not he could protect his own soul with his CE, or if he already actively does that to avoid getting a lot of damage done to him by the soul split katana. Another thing is, Yuta obviously doesn't know what this curse tool is, unless Maki told him off panel for some reason, but that's not ever stated or shown, so he wouldn't know. He needs to defend his soul to avoid an attack from the blade. Then last but not least, the inverted spear of heaven and how it would interact with Rika and whether or not it would deactivate her. I said in my last video that Rika would not get turned off by the inverted spear of heaven because the Viz translation of her being Yuta's curse technique is a mistranslation. That's still true, it's a mistranslation, but the argument I made doesn't really make sense either because it's also stated in the fan book that Rika is Yuta's curse technique, and as far as I'm aware, there are no differences between this Rika and the Rika in volume 0. It says that this Rika remained with Yuta when Orimoto passed away. So as far as I'm concerned, this is the same Rika and it's still just his curse technique like the fanbook says. Now, that being said, I don't know how Inverted Spear of Heaven would go about getting rid of Rika. Does it mean if Toji stabbed Yuta with it, the curse technique would stop? Or does he have to stab Rika with it to get the curse technique to stop? Does he have to just touch Rika with it to get the curse technique to stop? I don't really know. All I know is that the Inverted Spear of Heaven is for stoppage of a curse technique, and Rika is a curse technique. The final thing I want to touch on in this video is a statement made in chapter 222, and everyone should know what I'm talking about. The one that says Jujutsu High's main fighting force, or heavy hitters led by a Kotsu, will come for Sukuna if Gojo dies. I don't have too much to say about this, but Yuta hitting the hardest or whatever is not an issue of mine. Like I said earlier in the video, I do acknowledge that Yuta should be stronger than Toji / Maki, but again, I'll reiterate, Yuta cannot use everything he has access to in a fight with Toji / Maki. I also think that this picture labeling all of them as the heavy hitters or the main force kind of puts them at a sort of relative level in my mind. To me, if Yuta and Hakari could just beat down Maki with no difficulty, then those two would be the heavy hitters and there's no point in showing Maki, but all three of them are being highlighted instead of the whole class because, at least in my opinion anyway, they're all so far above everyone else and around the same level. But yeah, like I said, I don't have a whole lot to say about that statement. Anyway, that's pretty much it for the video. If you liked it, please leave a like on it, subscribe to the channel. Like I said, I do plan on doing way more JJK content. The next video is probably going to be about Gojo in some capacity, but I don't really know yet, still kind of planning it out. But yeah, other than that, have a nice day.